Hey, we're going to be in Luke 1, and I know we're kind of entering this season, and for some of us, we're really looking forward to this Thursday because we're going to all eat ourselves into a food coma, and it's going to be amazing. And I know most Sundays that you come, this Sunday particularly, is a Sunday where a pastor is going to come and talk to you about giving thanks and talks to us about having a thankful heart. And that's important, and it's good. I just didn't feel like that's where God was taking me today. So it's not going to be your typical before Sunday Thanksgiving sermon. And if that offends you or upsets you, I'm sorry, but I hope you can still stick with me and hear what I guess I feel God telling me to share with you. And plus, I also know just a few weeks ago, it hadn't been that long ago, that Sam shared that with you guys. So I want us to look at Luke 1, and I want us to talk about before the season, because believe it or not, next Sunday starts Advent. Advent is the Christian calendar of the Christmas time, and we are going to have 5 weeks or 4 weeks of Advent. Oh, look at that, I'm doing great now, aren't I? 4 weeks of Advent, and it's going to be this time of Christmas, and for most of us, we're already starting to gear up. Walmart's been there since October of this Christmas season. And some of you are just like them. You already have your Christmas decorations out because you love the season. You love this time of year. And it is a special, special time because we get to be with friends and family so much. We all usually get together. We make plans. We give gifts. We get gifts. We make great food and have lots of fun. And I know for most people that's the case. For some of us it's not. Sometimes it can be a lonely / depressing time. And actually, statistics would show that's up at this time of year because people feel alone. And if that's you, know that you have a church family and that you are loved and that we are here for you and we want you to be a part. And if you are feeling lonely and you need help, you need to talk about that. That's what we talked about a few weeks ago with that depression, getting it out in the open and telling people that you care about, that you're struggling, because we need to be there to help lift you up because we realize that. But this time in the season for me is one of my favorites. I love it, and I'm kind of excited to be back in Indiana again to be a part of this season because I love Christmas lights in the snow. It wasn't quite the same in Florida, seeing palm trees and your neighbors mowing your yard Christmas Day. So this is going to be a little bit new. It's been 10 years since we've been up here, and we're excited for the season. Katie and I both are. We both really love fall, so we got through a really good season, and I loved it until yesterday. It was so stinking cold. I forgot how cold it was, and man, my hands, I thought were going to freeze off yesterday. It was ridiculous, but we do love it, and we're excited, and I hope that you guys are starting to get some of that excitement. But there's this season that's coming, and there's a time in the Bible where it talks about it, and Luke 1 is right before Jesus' birth. And I kind of want to talk about that just to get us in the right frame of mind. And we're going to look at a guy named Zechariah, and we're going to look at his story and what we can learn from him, and maybe to put into place what we can do better this Christmas season, because there's a lot going on here, and that's why I'm going to give you some information, because there has been this what's called the 400 years of silence before this is written kind of deal. So basically what I mean by that is in Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament. And then Mark is what we believe to be written the first book of the, I know it's not the first in your Bible, but by time-wise, the first book written in the New Testament. There's 400 years of silence there. Now what I mean by that is it wasn't that God just fell off the face of the earth and was no longer with his people or there at all. But there's no one there speaking on God's behalf. There's no prophecies happening. It's probably kind of a down time, in all honesty. And this is kind of the time frame that Zechariah is in. So that he's been in this for his entire lifetime, probably, in this 400 years of silence. He's only heard stories and read in his Bible or Torah or the Old Testament scriptures and stuff that they had of what happened back then. And that's what he's believing to be true and believing and putting his faith in and serving that same God. But he's never really heard / seen what God can do because there's been kind of this time of silence. So it's kind of this weird thing going on. And then when we read Luke, one thing that I want you to know about him is he is a very detailed-oriented person. He's actually a doctor, and he likes the details. And it talks at the very beginning of this book, in the book of Luke, about how he's writing so that people can know what happened and have an accurate detail. He's detailed, but he also wants to have the facts. So he has researched this for us, and what we're going to read about Zechariah, and if you read the book of Luke, is to be true, because he wanted the facts and he wanted to be detailed about them. Actually, he's so detailed that the book of Luke and the book of Acts can be viewed as a historical document. And really, there's been archaeological digs, and none of them, all of the archaeological digs so far to date, none of them have been able to disprove the history and the facts that come from the book of Luke and the book of Acts. So when people talk to you about this Bible that you read, if they're not a Christian, and say it's not real, it's not true, why is it not true? Because you've not disproved it in my mind. And if you read a book called by Lee Strobel called Case for Christ, there's a student edition if you want to save yourselves a few pages of reading, which I did. And it's a really good book where he kind of does this investigation and realizes there's nothing really to disprove, especially the New Testament, the book of Luke and the book of Acts, to disprove anything of the facts that are in there. So it's one of these things, and some of you guys may have a Luke person in your life. The person I think of is a friend of mine, a dear friend. His name is Larry. Larry is in West Palm Beach, Florida right now. He is doing part of my job that I did down there in West Palm Beach, the maintenance part. And Larry was one of these guys that I would love to have him help me because I know it'd be done right. But I also hated to work with Larry to a point because he slowed me down. Because I'm a guy that's like, let's get the job done. And if I mess up, I'll tweak it to make it work. Larry is like, it's perfection and it's right. Like he'll talk through it each stage. How do you do this? And one of the things that I had to do before I left with Larry was give a detailed account of what I do. And what I mean by detailed is literally each button I press, how many times I press it, do I turn the knob left or do I turn it right? Like, it's crazy how detailed he was. But the nice thing about Larry is when he gave you an instructions, they were going to be long, but anyone could do it if you picked it up. And that's kind of what Luke is trying to do here. His thing isn't making sure that you can do something. His thing is, let's make sure that I have the facts in front of the people for them to be able to have a detailed way of knowing who Christ is. So that's kind of where we're getting to, and that's why in Luke, we get a little bit of history before Jesus even comes, and we get to hear this beautiful story about Zechariah. And so I want to get into it and dive into it a little bit. And one thing that I skipped about the 400 years of silence, that's a long time. If you guys don't know, some of you guys may somewhat know because you may have been Cubs fans, and you guys can realize what that's like waiting 108 years to be world champions again, which thankfully this year it happened. But what if you had to times that by almost 4? That would give you a realistic view of these 400 years of silence. So these people, Zechariah, when we read, I'm going to sometimes maybe make it sound like Zechariah is not a bad person. Has things messed up, but don't get me wrong. We all have things messed up, and we all have problems. But here's my problem with Zechariah that we're going to read and we're going to get to is he's kind of going through the motions, but everybody is at this time. Because nobody has heard from God from so long that they just are kind of coming and doing what they know to be that they should do. And that's okay, but they're just going through the motions. And for me, I know Christmas time can be that. It can be just doing the motions. Making sure I get with my family. Making sure I get the right presents. I have the right food. These sorts of things. And forgetting what it's all about. And so that's why I want to look at the book, or Luke 1, and read Zechariah. Now, I know I might have bored you some, and I gave too much information and context, but I think it'll help long term. But since I did, and some of you are somewhat falling asleep because it happens even to me sometimes, why don't you stand up real quick and just move around a little bit. Stand up. Everybody stand up. I know it's awkward, but if somebody's asleep that way, I know. If your husband or your wife or your youth is asleep, punch them and then wake them up. All right, now sit down. If somebody didn't stand up, we're worried about their sleeping, but it's all right if they are. What I want you guys to realize is, and the reason I wanted you to get up and get down is not just because it was fun to see, although it was. It really is, this is the meat. This is what I think God is trying to tell us. Because I believe, and I hope you do, in the last couple weeks, maybe couple months, maybe even few months for you guys, you hopefully are starting to feel and see some of the excitement and the things that are happening here at Big Lake Church of God. And it's going to need for us to get out of the motions and doing the normal. And there's going to be challenges that we're going to have and face and areas that we're going to be called to do and things that we're going to be called to do that aren't going to be comfortable. And I think if we can look at this story of Zechariah, hopefully we can learn what's going to need to be done. And hopefully God will speak through my words and what I've prepared and what I think He's given to me. And if He doesn't, I'm sorry I tried. But let's start by reading the first part. I want to start in Luke 1, verse 5 through 7. When Herod was the king of Judah, there was a Jewish priest named Zechariah. He was the member of the priestly order of and his wife Elizabeth was also from the priestly line of Aaron. Zechariah and Elizabeth were righteous in the eyes of God, in God's eyes, carefully to obey all the Lord's commandments and regulations. They had no children because Elizabeth was unable to conceive, and they were both very old. Okay, so the first thing that I want us to realize about Zechariah, because like I said, I believe he's kind of stuck in the motions, and we're going to get into that, but the first thing we need to really realize is he is a righteous person. He's considered by the passage, in God's eyes, he's to be right. He is righteous. Now, when I say that, he's doing the right things. He's going to church. He's following the laws. And here's something we have to realize when we're righteous. It doesn't always mean we're doing what God really 100% wants us to do, what He's called us to do. And we're going to find that out here in a little bit. Now, Zechariah, they're doing right. He's a priest. But as some of you know, not all priests, not all pastors are good, and are they in tune or righteous with God? But according to Luke, it is known that Zechariah is. Even though back in these days, Zechariah and Elizabeth didn't have a child, this would be a big stain / shame that they would be facing, because back in those days, if you didn't have a child, that was not good. And it was looked upon when something not good happened in your life, that meant you weren't right with God. So I'm sure there was people that talked behind their back that they weren't good, that they weren't righteous because they didn't have a child. But that's not the case. The facts are, according to Luke, that he is righteous in the sight of God. Now, I believe that Zechariah and most people were going through the motions back in those days. Even though Zechariah was considered righteous, I believe he was going through the motions. And the reason I get that is going to be from Luke 8 through 10. One day, Zechariah was serving God in the temple, for his order was on duty that week. And as it was custom of the priest, he was chosen by lot, meaning they cast dice, to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and burn incense. While the incense was being burned, a great crowd stood outside praying. Now some of you are like, where are you reading that into that he's going through the motions? Well, one thing that I kind of know, and I'm kind of reading into, is the fact that this is his job, he's doing it, and it's there. And the way I really get it is this. If you go skip ahead, or if you got to turn a page, but if you go to verse 21, it talks about this is now, something's happened in between here and there. Zechariah's in the temple, and we're going to get into that. But Zechariah and his fellow priests now are sitting outside waiting on him. It says, meanwhile, the people were waiting on Zechariah to come out of the sanctuary, wondering why it was taking so long. See, when we get in the motions of things, and I imagine when Zechariah was casting lots and getting ready to go in, it's been 400 years since you've heard from God and heard prophecy from God. You're probably wondering what you're doing to a point, because you know you're going to go in there, burn incense, and you're probably planning on just walking back out and it being a done deal. And obviously it shows in verse 21 that his fellow priests are standing around wondering why it's taking so long, because something actually did happen, and we're going to get into that in that time while he was in there burning incense. But they were so used to, there's like, kind of, for example, for us, if I go much more than 5 minutes over, some of you are going to be looking at your watch thinking, come on, Pastor, you got to shut it down. That's kind of what they're thinking. What's going on with Zechariah? What's really happening? Because he's going above the allotted time in the sanctuary, because they're just kind of going through the motions. They got some habits that they do, and they're good habits. They're great habits to have. They're burning incense, they're praying, they're going to church, doing the right things, but it's just become a habit. It's become a motion that they do, and something that they just do randomly over and over again, and it just happens. Just like for us, sometimes with this season, we go to the Christmas Eve service, we have this family tradition, this song has to be sung. Nothing that there's not wrong with traditions, please don't hear that. I'm not attacking them. They can be really good things. But we just get in the motion of doing what we're doing, the habits that we do. And some of them are really good habits. Zechariah is considered righteous in God's eyes because he's doing these good habits. But what happens is, and we're going to read, he's going through the motions, and one of the ways that you can tell is because when he comes into hearing from God for the first time in 400 years, like somebody is a written account that somebody's heard from God, he gets told these things, and then he's going to do something that just kind of proves my point. So let's continue to read, and let's see what I'm talking about in verse, let me turn my page. Verse 11 through 21, or 20, sorry. While Zechariah was in the sanctuary, an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing to the right of the incense altar. Zechariah was shaken and overwhelmed with fear when he saw him. Again, he's used to walking in, burning an incense, walking out. Nothing's ever really happened in his lifetime. This is what he does on a regular basis. But he's struck by fear because something actually happened. But the angel said, "Don't be afraid, Zechariah. God has heard your prayer. Your wife Elizabeth will give you a son, and you are to name him John. You will have great joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. For he will be great in the eyes of the Lord. He must never touch wine or alcohol drinks. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before his birth. And he will turn many Israelites to the Lord their God. He will be a man with the spirit and power of Elijah. He will prepare the people for the coming of the Lord. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, of the fathers to their children, and he will cause those who are rebellious to accept the wisdom of the godly." Zechariah said to the angel, "How can I be sure this will happen? I am an old man, and my wife is also well along in years." Zechariah has been going through the motions again because he has been praying for years to have a child. And back in those days, a girl was great, a boy was better. And I know that for some of you sad, especially you ladies thinking, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Back then, I'm just telling you the history. And so he is being told by this angel, everything that you wanted, this boy that you wanted is coming. Congratulations, this is going to be awesome. Not only that, but he is going to prepare a way for the Lord. This is like, he's going to be the golden child. And he is going to do all these great things. And you think by hearing that, he would just be like, Great. But Zechariah is like a lot of us, because when you're going through the motions, you always have an excuse or a reason why it can't happen. When God's calling you to do something and you're going through the motions, you always have an excuse or a reason why it can't happen. And what was Zechariah's? It was simply this. He's telling the angel this. How can I be sure this will happen? I'm an old man now, and as my wife is also along in years. He doesn't call her old. He's a smart man in that way. But he's basically saying, we're too old to have a baby. It doesn't make physical sense. And then the angel says, I am Gabriel. I stand in the very presence of God. It was he who sent me to bring you good news. But now, since you didn't believe what I said, you will be silent, unable to speak until the child is born, for my words will certainly be fulfilled at the proper time. Like I said, I believe that God has big things for Big Lake. It's one of the things that drew me here. But what I know is if we continue to go in the motions, when God calls us as individuals and God calls us as a church to move, if you're going through the emotions, you're going to have an excuse or a reasoning why it can't happen. So we're going to have to stop getting through the motions. See, Zechariah wasn't a bad guy. He's righteous. But he's like most of us. When God really calls us to do something, we realize we can't do it. And here's the thing. 100% of the time, we're right. We can't. But God can. And that's basically what Gabriel smacks him in the face with is, I stand in the presence of God. I'm telling you what he told me to tell you. And because you didn't believe, now you're going to be silenced. So now, Gabriel comes out of the sanctuary and can't talk. And I'm not going to read the passage, but it talks about how by his motions and by him not being able to speak, that people can tell he must have been in the presence of the Lord. I don't know what kind of motions he did. I don't know if the angel had wings, so he's doing the wing fly. I don't know. But somehow they got the point that he was in the presence of God. And then the really cool thing is he goes back to his wife Elizabeth after his duty is done, and then shortly after that, she becomes pregnant. And this is all in Luke 1, and you guys can go back and read it for yourselves as you want. But basically, what happens is she becomes pregnant, and then in the same passage, it talks about Mary getting her call to say that God tells her that she's going to have Jesus. And then she goes and visits Elizabeth, and then John, who is... Okay, now I got to keep... Elizabeth's son jumps in her belly with excitement, showing that who Jesus is, and then Elizabeth knows what that means. She knows that Mary's pregnant before she's even told her. She's excited, tells her how great it is to be her because she is going to have the Son of God, and what a blessing it is, and there's this really cool thing that happens there between them two, and I'll let you guys read it at a later time and date. What I want to stick on is Zechariah. What I want us to see is, one, that when we make the excuses, when we don't do what God's calling us to do, there's consequences. Now, I'm not saying that God isn't a loving God and that he is looking when you don't do what he wants, he's going to spank you every time. Because that's what I kind of look at what happened to Zechariah, the silence thing, was kind of a spanking, like, now here's your time out, go sit and think about what I did. I told you this, and you didn't listen. Now have a time out and think about it. Sometimes it just means you miss the blessing that God had for you. But there's always a consequence when we don't do what God's calling us to do. But one of the really cool things about the story of Zechariah is there's a happy ending. It's not all negative. It's not the fact that God didn't use him and just turned away from him. It's not that he was always silenced. It actually, at the end of the passage, which we're going to get to in a second, is that God was still able to use him. And God can still use us if we can get out of the motions and trust him. See, God still allowed him to go back home and Elizabeth to conceive a child who became John, who is known as John the Baptist. If you read the Gospels, who's prepared a way for the Lord, just as it says. And then at the end, after John is born, Zechariah has this beautiful gift and this blessing of being the first person in 400 years to start prophesying in the name of God, talking about who John is, what he's sent for, and what he's going to do. And here's the really cool thing. It came true. Showing that it's prophecy, that it's from God. It is what he said. And the same is true for us. A lot of times we get in the motions of just coming to church and sitting through a sermon and being nice, and every once in a while doing a nice thing, maybe putting a little bit of money in the offering plate, and going through these good habits, and doing and living a good life. It's a good thing to a point. Until it gets so mundane and so used to doing the same thing over and over again that when God calls you, you make an excuse or a reason why it can't happen. Because I believe here in the next few weeks, months to come, God is going to call all of us to do big things, things that will be out of our comfort zone. That's what I'm praying for. Because I am tired of doing the motions. Because, see, when I just do the motions, I don't get anything out of it. I just have the same habit of doing it over and over and over again. And although the habit may be good, I don't see the life change that I long to see. Because when Zechariah was challenged and when Zechariah was told and he got out of the motions, that's exactly what happened. Lives started to change. Excitement started to build. People started turning back to God. I know it was thousands of years ago when Zechariah lived. And I know that we haven't had any new chapters added to the Bible for thousands of years. And I know what we do here at Big Lake Church of God may not need to be another chapter or book of the Bible. But I also know that God still has a heart for his people. God still has a heart for the lost. But are we willing to get out of the motions to make it happen? To be a part, instead of being a part of the motion, be a part of action. The action that God has called us to be, which is loving, sharing his word, making disciples. I don't know what he's going to call you to do. I wish I did to make it easier so you could have someone to hold you accountable. But I know he calls. Just as he called Zechariah. My prayer for us is that we don't make excuses or reasoning why it can't happen, but instead we trust. I'm going to ask the worship team to come forward, and as they come forward, will you pray with me? Dear Lord, forgive me for going through the motions. Forgive us for being caught up in them. It's so easy to say, this is what I need to do day to day, and sometimes skip over what you're really calling us to do. But Lord, I'm so grateful that you loved us just as you loved Zechariah when he was going through the motions. I'm so grateful that you love us enough to forgive us. And I pray that we wouldn't miss out on your blessings because we make excuses for why we can't do what we think we can't do, because we know we can't. We're right, but we know you can. And I pray that we could put trust in you again, knowing that you can do all things, that you are bigger than all problems, that you are the God that created the world, the earth. That's pretty amazing. And why we stop trusting you sometimes, Lord, we don't know. But Lord, I pray this season, as we come to celebrate your Son coming, that we would realize that the power that we have in him, the grace that we are shown through him, that we don't have to be perfect, that we can make mistakes, and that you can still use us, and that there's power in that. And that we would take that power, that love, that grace, and show it to others, so that way we could see lives changed. Not because of what we did, but what you're doing through us, by us just being faithful to trust. Pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.